I have mixed feelings about the United States. I'm fascinated by it. I could easily spend my life driving around it. I have immense admiration for it. And there are days when I just wish it would go away. It's atrociously balmy. I've always told myself, whenever I felt that the United States was acting really foolishly or worse, a country that gives you Groucho Marx and Benny Goodman can't be all bad.
Welcome everyone, it's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive, and I've got a very special guest with me today. It is historian, former speechwriter for Prime Minister Paul Keating in Australia, Don Watson. Welcome, Don.
Hello, Jeff.
We're here to discuss your new book, The Shortest History of the United States, published by Black Ink Books. And congratulations on it. Maybe just for viewers outside of Australia, do you want to just quickly say what your sort of background is and how you came to write Shortest History of...
Well, it's a long while since I actually wrote history. I gave up being an academic, I think, in 1983, and written all sorts of different things since then. Often, historically informed, I suppose. Maintained an interest in history, but this was the first sort of straight history that I can remember writing for many years. And it was a bit of it's a curious thing. Murray Schwartz at Black Ink urged me to take it on. He's published a series of these shortest histories of different countries and one thing or another. And I guess this one looked utterly formidable. It's a big place, the United States, and incredibly complex. And there are a lot of truly great American historians I knew would be sitting on my shoulder through all this and weighing very heavily. So anyway, money drives, and I had to take. There was nothing else around at the time, so I took it on. And it took a lot longer than a shortest history should take. But that wasn't surprising either, I suppose, because it's an act of distillation. More than that, there is such a, you could write this history a dozen other times and it would come out different. You wanted to not only cover as much of the country as you could in all its various aspects, but you wanted to get the balance right. I have mixed feelings about the United States. I'm fascinated by it. I could easily spend my life driving around it. I have immense admiration for it. And there are days when I just wish it would go away. It's atrociously balmy. I've always told myself, whenever I felt that the United States was acting really foolishly or worse, a country that gives you Groucho Marx and Benny Goodman can't be all bad.
Yeah.
And I could name 100 others.
Yeah.
That's how I've thought about the United States for a very long while.
And that sort of that pull and push of love and hate, I guess, with the United States, or frustration and affection comes through in the book. I mean, you write early in the book that the USA is a history of ideas, but also of testing those ideas against experience. So how do you tell the overall story of such a complex place in, the shortest possible history of it?
Yeah, well, it's difficult. It is one, when talking about the United States, I always try not to use the word contradiction, because once you're trapped in that cliche, you'll never get out. There are so obviously contradictions in the US, but it's unique in that it's actually founded on ideas of natural law, of human liberty, and so on. And those ideas are written down in a constitution and a Bill of Rights and a Declaration of Independence. And they're backed up by all those Federalist Papers. It was founded by an extraordinary group of men, and no one since, with the possible exception of Lincoln and Roosevelt, FDR, have really been in the same league as those founding fathers. So you have these ideas drawn out of the Enlightenment, Locke, Montesquieu, David Hume, many others, and inherent in these documents. And then you have reality. You have burgeoning millions trying to make a life for themselves, and confronting all the time, as the frontier extends, new oppressive realities, things to deal with, huge possibilities, great disappointments, and a contest of ideas that grow out of that reality, particularly the fact of slavery, and that half the country is slave and half the country is free. So that these pressures threaten always to tear the country apart, right from the beginning. Within a few years of Washington's death, and Washington's aware that these things are going to tear it apart if the place isn't careful, even so much as to say that he feels that for the American Republic to survive, people must be good. They must behave themselves in the eye of God, at least, or it won't work. Now, that looked at one way, that is a bizarre idea that you can create this country out of nothing, a republic, above all a republic, a democracy as well, a democratic republic. I mean, Lincoln put it in the Gettysburg, he put it better than anybody had before or since, that this was this great experiment. Can it be done? And very often it looked like it couldn't be done. And desperate compromises were put in place to hold the republic together. So it's easy always to look at the United States and say the place is a bloody mess. It doesn't work. But you also have to look at it and say, well, the ambitions were pretty extraordinary for the late 18th century. Not even late, really, mid to late. And that it has held together is extraordinary. And whatever you might say about its sins, it has provided and its failures, it's provided hope and good lives for millions and millions of people. So it has been a bit of a beacon, a serious beacon, though it has also flickered violently very often.
Yes, indeed, indeed. You mentioned the Enlightenment tradition, very influential in the founding of America as well. I mean, that continues to, I guess, play out in liberal progressivism and et cetera through 19th, 20th centuries as well, even, I guess, today, in contrast with, I think, what you describe as a kind of a frontier mentality of whatever it takes, a sort of more I don't know, a ruthless approach to life. Do you want to maybe talk about some of the later incidents in American history that reflect that tension as well, that you describe in your book?
Yeah, well, I guess it's what frontier, no, those physical frontiers do in Australia and in most of those so-called New World countries. There were certain imperatives and exigencies which had to be met, and the ideas of the Enlightenment were not really foregrounded in meeting them. Basically, the frontier didn't operate according to the rules of laid down by John Locke or anyone else. And out of that emerged a kind of an American, I think, who was above all a practical person, a person of deep practical abilities, very often with a religious mentality built in, and often it reinforced the practicality. And so, I mean, to explain this, you probably need to go back. We have to always remember that America was half founded in a religious mission in those New England Protestant dissenters. It was also founded in the interest of commerce. And those two streams of American life have had to find ways to coexist. Now, that has always been one of the tensions. At the same time, the North became insisted on being after a while at least, they became anti-slavery. And the South's plantation economy demanded slaves. And that was the other great tension for a very, very long while. The first 7 presidents of the United States were slave owners. Jefferson had 600 slaves, no less. So this is one of of course, the great weaknesses of those hallowed founding documents, that slavery somehow is reconciled with humanity's right to liberty. And the other large section of the population, which is entirely ignored, are women. That also has to be resolved somehow over the next couple of centuries. So I think, for argument's sake, I think you have to sort of think of America held together by a set of ideas in these documents and in a way in the iconography of those founding fathers in some sense. And that really is all there is to hold it together, and some sense of self-interest, which is more often than not competing self-interest. And the miracle is that it has actually kept going for as long as it has. And I think it's, Jeff, it's probably worth bearing in mind also this, which someone explained to me, a Republican explained to me a long while ago, explained to me quite forcefully, as if I was completely barking up the wrong tree, talking about American democracy. He said, forget about the democracy, that's an add-on. America's a republic. This is what you have to, and this is what we defend. That's what was defended by the North in the Civil War. That's what's always got to be held together. Even some slavers, like John Calhoun, and old Jackson said, Jackson said, "I'll hang the first man wherever he's from if he wants to pull the republic apart."
I mean, that's interesting what you say, because I know I've received many comments on my YouTube channel over the years from Americans saying, making that point exactly, that don't criticize us for being weak in our democracy, because we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic kind of thing. And it's interesting that has such a strong value within American political discourse. You did mention slavery, and there's been a big debate about that and the importance of slavery in the sort of national narrative of America over the last 10 or so years. There was that 1619 project, I think it was called, that provoked a lot of controversy. What's your take on the role of slavery in the sort of American history story?
Well, I think right from the beginning, the founders were aware that it might be a real problem. It's more complicated than it looks, in a way, but it has a pretty profound effect on American politics, up to and including the Civil War, of course. It is the divisive element. No one was entirely innocent in this. I mean, Northerners were often governed by commercial interests as much as any other in their thinking about slavery. But I guess the simplest way to talk about it is in terms of the Civil War. I mean, even Lincoln he was opposed to slavery, but it was not really front of mind when the war started with Lincoln. There's a whole range of opinions from the abolitionists through to the slave owners, I suppose. But you can't really talk about American history, certainly antebellum American history, without talking about slavery. These days, on the right at least, people are looking for ways of saying even that, well, much like Calhoun, who said way back in the 1840s, these slaves have actually, in a sense, never had it so good. Their lives, however bad they were in the United States, were much better than they were in West Africa, which seems to me largely nonsensical, but an appealing argument for those who are vulnerable to being appealed to. And more recently, it's been pointed out that the great majority of the slaves were originally captured and sold to European slavers by other African merchants, tribes. And this is highlighted in those elements of the press that want to apologize for slavery and say we shouldn't be hung up about it. This also seems to me to be disingenuous at best, and historically silly. I mean, it's not really in that. It's not actually in the capture of them that the problem lies. It lies in the fact that a democracy is trying to exist and live by a set of standards which slavery violates. And the experience of slaves, the great majority of slaves in the United States, is hideous by and large, and it corrupts the American system in so many ways. It corrupts the growth of the democracy, the strength of the republic. That's really what the history is about.
You talk about America having been born with one foot in the church and one foot in commerce, and you sort of talked about that a little bit earlier as well. But the role of I guess religious evangelism does seem very powerful in American history. Maybe church and commerce came together in the figure of the tele-evangelist, the perfect synthesis of American 20th century history. But it also seems to be a very powerful religious evangelism, Christian nationalism, that sort of thing seems to be a very powerful influence, even like right at the moment within American politics as well. How do you see that strain of American history playing out today?
Yeah, it's interesting because America had the Great Awakenings, so-called, which were you begin with the New England settlers who were trying to set up, in a way, Christian commonwealths, and those, for all their crimes, if you like, we think of the witchcraft trials and those sorts of things. They were. It's not hard to find massive levels of hypocrisy and God knows what, but they did, in a way, lay down some of the ambitions of the United States, which end up in the Constitution and in the way Americans see themselves. The other thing that comes out of that is that, unlike here, there's no established church, and there's this notion that if you don't like, religion is a contested space. So if you don't like your preacher, or if you think that he's strayed from your interpretation of Scripture, then you go and start another one. So to an outsider, there's an amazing number of churches in America. In most country towns in Australia, you'll find, there'd be probably a Catholic church, and then maybe 2 or 3 Protestant churches. Not many people going to the Protestant churches anymore. Some of them have become pancake parlours and apartments where they just sit there on the landscape. In the United States, in a town of 20,000 people, you might find 60 or 70 churches. It is an entirely different religious landscape. And there is this idea in the United States that from very early on, that without religion, that religion's an essential bulwark of the republic, of the place hanging together. There's the idea of that in a way that we don't experience in Australia, that God is alive and living with America, that America has God's blessing. All these sorts of things to an outsider are very unusual, and I find intriguing when I'm there. And it does, in a way, empower the country. But what's curious is that most of the founders were, if not agnostic, they were deists, or none of them would admit to outright atheism, but they were certainly not anything like the evangelicals that have swept through America at various times, all the way up to Billy Graham, and now, They're sort of still a very powerful force.
Mm.
So you can't really separate. One of the things about it is that I think is that there's never been an absolute conviction that church and state should be separated, although that is a fundamental Enlightenment principle. So you have someone who now, you've had the very powerful influence of, in our own times, of the evangelical churches, but now with, for instance, Charlie Kirk, J.D. Vance, the notion of
Pete Hegseth as well, sort of
becomes a
Christian
little broad.
nationalist stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like so much else, I mean, what Charlie Kirk was proposing, what Vance talks about to some extent, does have its origins not in the founders, although George Washington was always a good, God-fearing Christian. There's always, the links are always there. I mean, this is what I found. I've always found so interesting about the United States. That complex as it is, there's the historical threads have never been broken. So, and that's why I think the brief visit of Alexis de Tocqueville in the early 1830s and what he wrote subsequently, having been there for 8 or 9 months and never crossed the Mississippi, is still so pertinent. He still seems so extraordinarily right about what he said about the United States, because really everything has changed and nothing has changed. These forces are still at work.
Yeah.
And he was onto them.
Yeah.
And one of the things he did say was that I've always found, it's not always emphasised, but it always seemed to me the important thing he said was how fundamental it was for a democracy to survive. And he's writing, of course, as a French aristocrat who's curious about these new democratic movements. He's saying, actually, freedom of association is a very good idea. Don't worry about it, because every monarchist was terrified of freedom of association. It actually holds everything together and keeps people quiet. They all get together in their glee clubs and their mechanics institutes and their buffalo lodges and their Rotary clubs and their commercial, all those sorts of things actually gel the community together. It's very important. And there were many, many other observations he made which still hold now.
I guess the church has also been a big, or religion has also been a big influence on, I guess, we've talked about the conservative side of politics, but it's been a very major creative force for the progressive hopes of America as well. You mentioned the role of women, major role in the temperance movement, major role in, prohibition, major role in sort of,
music.
Early 20th century progressivism, Martin Luther King, so on and so forth. So yeah, it's an ambiguous or ambivalent, complex legacy.
Because it's so important in the language, which I think is underestimated in American life. And I think it's one of the things why America looks a little fragile at the moment, because I think the rhetorical power of American politics has begun to fade and wear out. But it's important, I think, to remember that America was founded in in a great age of the English language. So, Australia was founded, the Federation was founded in a time of high Victorian pomposity, really. And we don't get those ringing language that the Americans inherited and Lincoln revived. But it also goes into the music and popular culture of the United States. They're never short of something to say. And even in their, what the English would regard as bastardization and unspeakable bastardization at that, there's a sort of poetry in American patois that is riveting, and I think helps to hold the place together. You know, that it's hard to think of any words in our country's historical life that come close to the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence or Lincoln's first and second inaugural speeches. It's hard to think of anything that has been spoken by an Australian leader that could be satisfactorily engraved into the walls of the equivalent of the Lincoln Memorial. And these things in American life, rather like the popular culture, I think, need to be looked at, recognised as important, an important part of the bonding of American life, and an important part of the way Americans see themselves. They're not just a diversion; they're actually at the core.
When people talk about it, you know, being a nation formed in an idea, it's partly also a nation formed in a political rhetoric. You know, the we the people, sort of all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, you know, we should be as a city upon a hill.
Yeah, exactly. Yes,
it's
light's very dim now.
And Reagan got it and sort of, you know, bastardized it, but it did for him really well. You know.
Yeah.
You know, if you got up in Australia and said it's morning in Australia, you know, then you'd be pelted with tomatoes.
Yeah. That's right. One of the tensions, I guess, in America's self-understanding is, you know, in brutal terms, is it an empire or a republic these days? And that becomes a bigger debate during the 20th century as it rises to sort of global dominance, especially after World War II. How do you see that issue of America's, you know, globally dominant role becoming the most powerful nation on earth, and some argue it then distorts the political institutions of the republic as well?
Yeah. Well, see, again, that was a great concern of the founders, you know, that if you're a republic, you can't be an empire. I mean, what you've done is just freed yourself from the tyranny of empire and of kings. By the way, that's an important point to be made, especially in connection with what's happening now, is that for all its radical elements, the founders really left in place a pile of kingly powers which now leave even a well-disposed president with much greater executive powers than any European monarch has. They've always been there. And it is, in one sense, America, an elective monarchy. And Trump is now making that very clear. But the other notion that America would not be an expansionist empire has been tested and found wanting again and again. Whenever American interests have been threatened abroad or perceived to be threatened, American commercial interests or strategic interests, America has not hesitated for long before taking whatever measures were necessary in Central and South America, in the Pacific, or in Asia, and in Europe eventually. So it couldn't stay out. I mean, it's fluctuated between seeing its protecting its interests abroad and moments of isolationism. Ultimately, it always has to come back. I mean, you can see that in Trump. Trump, I think, is natively an isolationist. That's where he would prefer to be. It doesn't work like that. Therefore, he's had to go and solve 8 wars, as we know,
Yeah.
peace across the world.
Yes.
But
I think there's a journalist who says that MAGA really means mega, which is make the empire great again. But anyhow.
yes, it's interesting. But the post-war thing is truly interesting because FDR, in a way, pulls off a most astounding thing. You know, he tries to keep the United States out of the war, and he knows, but he wants them in it, but he doesn't want to lose either the electorate or American men and material. And eventually he has to go into the war. But at the same time, the United States turns its industry to war machinery, and it basically finances the entire war effort. It produces the material. The figures I found just truly astonishing is what the Ford factories could suddenly produce in the way of tanks and aircraft and so on. All those. So the United States comes out of the Second World War. Roosevelt, by the way, with Lincoln, seems to me the most significant post-revolutionary American leader by quite a stretch. He had his share of luck, and he did a couple of things that don't make him perfect, but he does manage to save American liberal democracy and American capitalism. Then he manages a phenomenal American war effort and sets America up for its pretty well unchallenged strategic dominance post-war. But when this happens, and those, things like the United Nations are established and Marshall aid is triumphant in Western Europe. But once America is determined to feels that the USSR is its prime enemy, communism is its prime enemy, communism at home is a prime enemy, the idea of containment becomes an ideology in a way, a reflex, a groupthink. And without excusing the efforts of the Soviet Union abroad, it seems to me to debilitate American prospects. Becomes politically convenient for politicians of both sides to be anti-communist, so-called, and it becomes a sort of reflexive attitude throughout the world that whatever smells even faintly of communism means America must go there and stop it. So the competition with the Soviet Union is a kind of zero-sum game for both sides. And I think all sorts of opportunities are lost as a result. The Vietnam War, for instance, it was not inevitable that America had ended up fighting the communists in Vietnam. It was not inevitable that Vietnam, I don't think, became a client of the Soviet Union and ended up fighting a war with horrendous consequences for years with the United States. And it was Australia. But here is the reversal, I suppose, that Roosevelt tells Churchill, I'm sorry, in effect, but your British Empire is going to have to withdraw. These things are not, any longer acceptable. We don't want empires anymore. But he ends up supporting the French in Indochina, the empire, the French empire. So it doesn't, this is the way history plays out, as we all know, not with any kind of necessary logic to it.
Yeah.
But something, in a way, in America's great post-war blooming, there are some problems, and if you trace them through, you can see even now those problems as having their origins back then.
And arguably, in the decades of its greatest power, the United States has perhaps failed to deal with some of the social problems within the United States that are driving some of that polarization today. I think in the book you refer to it being more polarized than at any time since the Civil War, the 19th century Civil War, and I guess to me at least, one of the most typical examples of that sort of failure to deal with social problems is the healthcare system in the United States, notoriously dysfunctional. How do you see what's your assessment of how well America is dealing with its political polarization, but also its social conflicts at the moment?
Well, it's not dealing with them very well at all. The healthcare system I think there are probably two elements to that. One is greed, commerce, the interests of the insurance companies. That's one. Then there's the strangely distorted American mind, which is easily persuaded that anything to do with the state is bad. It's a feeling particularly strongly held by people who depend entirely on the state. Many of them are in MAGA and have been on benefits for generations, but have long since forgotten that it's actually coming from the state that they so despise. It's a strange thing to hear essentially poor people in Ohio, for instance, cheering John McCain when he derides the notion of spreading the wealth. These people have had wealth spread to them for a long while. And the health system is, so there's a kind of clash of, again, it's private interests protecting themselves or being protected by politicians, and an ideological position, a sort of free enterprise ideological position, regardless of whether free enterprise is serving these people or not. It's a kind of reflex. And there's a third thing involved in that as well, that so long as America had a kind of empire, an empire that was sort of hidden from the people, that the people never see, most Americans don't see themselves as being in the homeland of an empire. They're remarkably unaware of how far their influence reaches. And as a result, they're remarkably unaware of how things are done in other countries. So they will see Obamacare, for instance, as absolutely socialism, beyond the pale sort of thing. You don't want anything about. You cannot tell them, however hard you try, that in these so-called socialist countries, in which they aren't socialist, they provide healthcare which is superior to the Americans at a fraction of the cost. That just can't be told. And the other system is so deeply entrenched in America that they fear you can always politically make a mess of someone suggesting something as radical as Obamacare or socialised medicine, or something like ours, a mix of private and social and so on. These are endemic sorts of problems in the US, and healthcare, I guess, is one of them. I think we should also say that in the period of America's great post-war wealth, there were already these serious fractures. For instance, in the South, Black Americans lived under an apartheid system, a terrorist system, a caste system, which good people, person though he was, Eisenhower didn't really want to get involved with. This, because he didn't, eventually it comes home to roost. So it comes home in the civil rights movement, in a hell of a lot of violence, and in a country that is still deeply racist, and in which underprivilege falls heavily on Black communities. And it still plays out in unspoken ways in every American election.
Oh, and it comes out very much in the whole debate around, migration, etc. I mean, so much of America is actually, in practical daily terms, dependent upon undocumented, largely, Latin American labour. And yet, so much of discourse is, throw these people out. They don't belong to our country.
Yes,
Particularly under Miller. Yeah.
And it is extraordinary. A few years ago, 2016, the year that Trump was elected, I went.
Yeah.
I drove around Wisconsin. I thought Wisconsin would be a election really be decided in Wisconsin and Michigan, and it's the great dairy state, the cheese state. It's not very good cheese. Sorry, Americans, not great cheese. But they never saw a cow. Coming from a South Gippsland background, really, cows in the kitchen, just about. You never saw a cow. They're all in these massive barns, and you say, and this is not in winter. I mean, they're not in there to keep them out of the snow and ice. It is cold in Wisconsin. They're there all the time, and they're milked by Mexicans. They're milked by Central Americans, who you can't see either. They're in the barns with the cows, and this is sort of normalized. It seems to me a kind of normalized and sanitized form of indenture, which is very important, quite apart from slavery. I mean, vast numbers of American immigrants in the 18th and into the 19th century were indentured. And it has sort of continued. Although these, I don't know, I couldn't tell you what their contracts require of them, but it's at least a shadow version of a very old system.
Yeah.
And if you go to, the better suburbs of Los Angeles, then there's the wealthier suburbs of Los Angeles, all the work is being done, the nannying and the rest is being done by Central and South Americans or African Americans. If you go to New York, it's the same. The inequality, which is extreme at the moment, has nevertheless always been there. That I suppose, look, anybody who writes history knows that you find these familiar threads. Things turn up 100 years earlier that ring with something that you see now. But in America, it seems to me it's that phenomenon times 100. That there is this, for all the sort of the great unknown possibilities of America, for all the chaos and the polyglot nature of America, it is a strangely consistent story. Everything seems to echo something else. And Americans often seem to me to, including the sort of liberals I know, often seem to me to talk with a profound knowledge of their country, but a strange lack of comprehension of other things. That and it has to do with the fact that America is the chosen land. That that this is what life is about. This is what human prospects are about. This is what human possibility is about. And all those things are true in one way. But there are examples elsewhere from which Americans might learn, but their minds are largely closed to them.
And this brings us to the final chapter of your book, which is entitled The Unravelling. And you did say earlier in the discussion that one of the remarkable things about American history is that it's been able to hold together for so long. What did you mean by the title of your chapter, The Unravelling? Do you see America as not being able to hold it together for that much longer, or what do you think?
I think we don't know, but I think there are worrying signs that it might unravel. And I think they've been there certainly since the election of the first Trump administration. And I don't think, we need many examples to demonstrate the truth of this problem. But the January the 6th invasion of the Capitol was, was both real and symbolic. And what Trump has done since his re-election means that really he's and what Project 2025 implied was, and what some of the tech bros who have immense influence in the United States, what they've said about democracy, that is to say, it no longer suits us, means that the project that, as defined by Lincoln, is on the way out. It's no longer the aim of some very powerful people. Even Trump's, having coins minted in his name, he must be aware of the Roman, of Emperor Julius Caesar as emperor and so on. He must be aware of Napoleon and.
He surely must have a horse that he wants to honour in some way.
Yes, he may charge a horse into the Potomac or something. But I think the trouble is, you say, well, the unraveling begins with Trump, but of course it doesn't. I think in some ways it begins, and be easy enough to say, oh no, it began before that. In a way, it begins with the New Deal. The moment Roosevelt decides that the only way to save American capitalism is through radical social experiments, radical social programs, a hard core of American ideologues and capitalists decide this man has to be stopped. And an awful lot of conservative American politics ever since has been a sort of program to wind back the New Deal. But at the same time, presidents both Democratic and Republican, including Nixon, were by modern standards democratic socialists, New Dealers. And it's worth remembering, that for all the cynicism of American politics, there was a great deal of altruism in the likes of LBJ's program, and even, political sacrifice. He knew with his civil rights bill that he wouldn't lose the Democratic South. Won back briefly by Jimmy Carter, but generally it's been it now is a Republican stronghold, and it's pretty hard to move it. So then I think, it's almost a cliche of modern political understanding that the adoption after Reagan of neoliberalism by the Democrats, and the decision partly driven by that idea that if the Democrats were going to outflank or take up what were essentially Republican economic ideas, then we will oppose them. We will just simply oppose them in everything, which was what under Newt Gingrich in the House they did. And then it seems to me you got the hardening of the beginnings of the polarization, I suppose, at the Washington level. And then the balmy neocons and the war in Iraq and the Middle East, which has been a calamity in myriad ways. And then I suppose Obama's refusal, or his decision to really let them off the hook after the great financial crisis, bringing, the people who were largely responsible for the financial crisis into his cabinet. So it felt to a lot of working class Americans that he was more interested in saving the banks than in saving them. Obama sort of, of course, he also inspires a lot of largely unspoken racism. Trump is onto it immediately with his birther campaign. So, Trump doesn't come out of nowhere. He is a certain kind of American. He paints a little bit of piety and religion onto it every now and again when it suits him. I did see him in 2016 to a gathering of Christian Americans, describe himself as a Presbyterian, and the roof didn't fall in, which seems to me one of the disproofs of God's existence. But basically, he is the American shyster, the chancer, huckster, the criminal, the greed merchant, the vulgarian,
the American hustle,
carpetbagger, the whole works. And he's a recognisable figure, but who understood one thing that people hadn't got onto, and it really was that in the modern media environment, it didn't matter what you said so long as you were the news.
At least in the short term, I guess. I guess the question is whether that works in the longer term, and whether you sort of get found out, and maybe that's kind of where he's maybe falling a bit flat now, because just 24/7 news cycle stuff works for a while, but then you end up getting very, very confused, and no one really knows what the hell is going to come next out of the Trump administration, do they?
No, and the question will be, I don't think there's any doubt he wants a third term, and Steve Bannon says he's going to get a third term, and they have a plan to get a third term. That would require you to believe that J.D. Vance is going to put his ambition aside. So there's an awful lot of politics to be resolved just on the Republican side at the moment. I don't know. No one knows how it's going to play out. I think the worry is that you have to, if you believe in American liberal democracy and that in its ultimate triumph, you have to believe that it can be got back. You know, now so much has been done. Can you get it back? And will people go quietly? Well, don't know. Will MAGA just fade away? I don't know.
And I guess that's a question for, people in Australia and, countries affiliated around the world. I mean, there are many people around the world who have a sort of, I guess, as you were describing, a real sense that there was a beacon of hope there in America, but there's, this increasing doubt that whether that is really a realistic thing. But could I just ask you, maybe in closing, a question about what your book says to Australians or to other people in other US allied countries who, feel that sort of loyalty to the United States. Perhaps some people are starting to question whether it's such a sensible thing. And as an example of that, of course, your former boss back in the 90s, Paul Keating, has referred in Australia to the Austral Americans who sort of chain Australia to, I think he says, a fading Atlantic empire and to survive. Of course, you worked for Paul Keating in the early 1990s, if I remember correctly, early to mid 1990s. And, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. I don't know if you're necessarily participating in any of those debates, and you certainly, you have your own views and quite separate from Paul Keating and all that sort of thing. But nonetheless, there is a big debate within Australia at the moment about, or at least in some quarters, at least on my YouTube channel, about the extent to which Australia should remain as loyal to the US if that American project is really disintegrating. What's your viewpoint on that?
Well, I think even if the American project was not unraveling or disintegrating or whatever, I think there's a lot to be said for thinking again about our alliance with the Americans. And I don't think it's an anti-American position to say so. I think it's just simply a matter of saying, well, what if when Anthony Albanese went surrounded by the lunatic media circus, it would seem mainly concerned about whether he would be humiliated by Trump. But if he'd gone there and had said, look, we're a bit different down here. We don't really think the way you do. Good on you. We like you, but we're going to go our own way. We've got strategic interests which don't align in every regard with yours. We think we can, and we're certainly going to look at ways we can defend ourselves against whatever the threat might be. We don't think we are. There is a natural fit in the way that our predecessors in Australia thought there was a natural fit. In fact, it's got us into more trouble than we'd like, really. AUKUS, no, bad idea. Doesn't make any sense to us. We're not going to do that. Now, if he'd said that, apart from the fact that 3 or 4 advisors with whose whole careers depend on their connection to Washington, who would probably fall off their chairs and dead or in a faint, nothing much else would happen, really. What would happen? I mean, the Americans, they would run around in a panic for a while, but what would happen in Australia is that I think people would say, a bit scary, but, well, let's think about what we should be doing. Because at the moment, AUKUS, which let's say AUKUS, for the moment, is represents our alliance with the United States. It has never been explained to the people at all. I ask anyone in the street what it means, and they wouldn't have a clue, because neither Morrison nor Albanese has ever seen fit to explain it. And we've forked out $800 million at least already for something that has no obvious advantages to anybody except those who are backing it. So, I mean, if you read Hugh White's most recent quarterly essay about AUKUS, and if everybody was required to read it, you would find, I think, that perhaps 15% of the population would be in favour of it. I think the really interesting thing to contemplate in our loosening our ties with the United States is how we would, for the first time, we would think about our place in the world without a great and powerful friend there as an umbrella. It was Britain for so long, then it became America, and we have never contemplated not only how we might act in the rest of the world, particularly in our region, without that umbrella, how we would act independently in our own interests, but how it would change our entire understanding of ourselves, how we would think about ourselves as Australians or whatever else you want to think about it. I think it would free our minds immensely. It would change the debate into much more dynamic areas, and I think in many ways much more productive areas. And if you want to see, I mean, I've always thought this about the difference between the United States and Australia. And the first essay I ever wrote on it back in the early 2000s, called Rabbit Syndrome, it was really about that, how the American Republic produced people of great independence and self-regard, a different kind of confidence about them. Whereas we produce people who were always obliged to tug the forelock. And because we were obliged to tug the forelock, it made our nationalism a little abrasive and silly sometimes as a sort of compensation. So I don't think in whatever time is left to me that I'm going to see Australia be brave enough to do this. But I think it would make us, it would be an act that made us braver in the longer term. So I am pretty much in total agreement with Paul about this. I think he's been largely right. And I don't think it helps to sort of argue the toss about how dangerous China is or what sort of a threat China is to us. That's not really an answer to his argument. In a way, his argument is the stronger for saying we have to treat China or any other threat on our terms, in terms of the threat to us and our needs, and whether we might actually be able to negotiate a better way for us, rather than say, well, whatever makes America stronger in the Asia Pacific makes us stronger, because that may not be the case.
Yeah.
I don't think it is, to be honest.
Yeah, and it's been a fascinating year in that regard too, because in some ways, some of the countries of the Asia Pacific, like India, like Indonesia, have shown the kind of oh well, America's unhappy with us, so what kind of perspective of things, or if America doesn't get its way, you know, or if it imposes tariffs on China, let alone herd in McDonald Islands, then you know, the sky's not about to fall in.
No.
Maybe that's an example of how, you know, we I think Gandhi once said that Britain remains in control of India, because Indian minds keep India there, keep Britain there. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like Australian minds are keeping America
That's
there,
very true.
as well as in many other places around the world.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Don, well, thank you so much for your insights into the history of the United States. I'll just share with the viewers the book there. Hopefully it will display properly. If not, I'll put a little icon over that. And will you presumably be doing some promotion of your new book in other places as well over the next little while, so people may well see you there?
Sydney and Brisbane over the next few days, and then some in Melbourne.
Fantastic.
I'm
But I'm sure.
competing with a lot of books this time of the year, Jeff.
Well, there you go. Well, hopefully for both Australian viewers and international viewers, you've seen one of the great political speechwriters of Australia, but also a very fine historian.
Thank you, Jeff.
Of Australia. I know I read your book about the Kurnai, the Aboriginal the Highlanders and Aboriginal thing.
Caledonia Australians.
Yeah, that's right. I can't remember the name, but I really enjoyed it.
Book.
It's a wonderful book. Yeah. And I'll include links to some of your books in the video description below. So thank you so much for joining me, Don.
Thank you, Jeff. All the best.
Are you a man or a mouse? You put a piece of cheese down there and you'll find out.